So dear students, let us start our today's class. I committed to you that before starting the class, I will try to answer some of your questions which you raised throughout the day after the presentation of today's video. As for example, some of you questioned Upal Maji questioned, Sir, while recording the isotonic contraction on the rolling drum, is the lever acting as a load? So I have drawn it here. So this is the muscle. This is attached with the lever. This is attached with the lever, and this is the fulcrum, and it is attached with the moving drum. So obviously, as the muscle is contracting, it is trying to pull the load. Here the only load before the muscle is the fulcrum or the recording lever. This recording lever, this is the only load. So I can show you the instrument as such. Where we record all these things. So this is the lever, and here the muscle is attached. With this limb of the lever, and this is the fulcrum. So when the muscle is contracting, it will pull the fulcrum like this. And it will record. So when the muscle is pulling, weight of this lever included. So this is the fulcrum. Weight of this lever is acting as a load. So you are correctly pointed out. Here the recording lever, the stylus, is also acting as a load. Now what we can do, we can increase that load by adding some weight in it. We can add some load, thereby increasing the weight of the recording lever, or weight of the stylus. We can add some load, small loads and further loads. In that way we can add some load, and thereby we can increase the load of the lever, and thereby increasing the amount of afterload which this muscle has to overcome at the time of contraction. So that you can do. So your question and your answer is completely correct, that it is the weight of the lever is actually acting as a fulcrum, acting as a afterload, in which we can add up some extra load by adding various weights. So that is one answer, and a good answer rather. Then somebody asked that somebody says Anish Day. He commented, Sir, will not the application of afterload of infinite magnitude lead to isometric contraction? That is his question. Whether if I increase this afterload more and more, whether that will not lead to the isometric contraction? I must say, Anish Day, it is absolutely correct. So if we go on increasing the afterload, a point of time will come when even the most powerful contraction of the muscle will not capable of elevating the load. Then both ends of the muscle will behave as a fixed end, and this isotonic lever arrangement will lead to an isometric contraction. Now one thing I need to add here. We need to ensure that when the muscle is loaded, this loading may be either a pre-loading or maybe a after loading. No, this very arrangement is a preloaded state. That means muscle, so if I apply load, whether the simple weight of the lever or with the additional weight, all these weights through this fulcrum are stretching the muscle, isn't it? All this weight with the help of the fulcrum is stretching the muscle. So here it is a preloaded state. But we can apply one thing. We can apply a screw. We can apply a screw and apply that screw here. If this screw is in place, then weight of the lever, weight of the writing stylus will not be borne by the muscle before contraction. So in the resting state, so if this lever is there, if this screw is there, this is in red one, if this screw is in place, that screw will prevent stretching of this muscle before contraction. And this screw is known as after loaded screw or after load screw. I will show you this screw. So this is the screw, this is the screw. If this screw is there, it will prevent, and if this screw is there, it will prevent. So this is the muscle. If the screw is in place, it will prevent the muscle to get stretched at the resting state. Muscle will only loaded when it is contracting. So when the muscle will contract, like this, then and then only this load will be applied on this. Otherwise, when muscle is in the resting state, that load will not be applied. The load will not be applied on the muscle. So this red indicated screw is known as afterload screw. If I put this screw in place, then it will prevent preloading, only allow afterloading. Right? So this is the situation. This is actually the experimental setup which we used to perform. Even we used to demonstrate you, but in this situation of pandemic, we cannot do so. So this is about the preload and afterload. And if we remove the diagram, erase the diagram here. So we can say that during preload, muscle is stretched before contraction. During preload, the muscle is stretched before contraction. And during afterload, muscle is being loaded during contraction. So preloading means pre-contraction stretching of the muscle. Preload implies it is the pre-contraction stretching of the muscle. That is preload. And afterload indicates this is the resistance of heart against the contraction. So when the contraction is happening, occurring, muscle is performing, it has to overcome some resistance, some load, and that is known as afterload. And we also drawn you the different two diagrams of preload and afterload. This is the preloaded curve, and this is the curve of afterload. This is the preloaded curve. Here the preload. Here is the afterload. So this is Starling's diagram. And here we can say ventricular performance, here we say the stroke volume, here we say the velocity of contraction. So velocity of contraction indicating the performance and stroke volume is also indicating the performance. Here preload is EDVV and here is afterload. So one is directly related almost linearly, another is indirectly related but not linearly, rather a bit non-linearly. So this much we described in my last class. Now let me see, is there any other question? Then we shall move forward. Achha. So somebody commented, Omkita, sir, is EDV is preload. That is perfectly correct. End-diastolic volume is preload. I think it is not just reflect the preload, because preload is same in right and left ventricle, but end-diastolic volume is high in left ventricle as it takes some extra blood in its atrium due to joining of bronchial vein with pulmonary vein. So this amount of blood is not much significant. This amount of mixing of blood is not much significant. It is significant in diluting the oxygen concentration to some extent. That is covered in the respiratory physiology. That means when the blood is passing through the alveolar capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen becomes 100 millimeter of mercury, and when it reaches the heart, it becomes around 97 millimeter of mercury. This 3 millimeter of mercury dilution is due to addition of this bronchial circulation, etc. So this bronchial circulation affair, it is a bit significant in terms of mixing of oxygen is concerned. But as per volume is concerned, it is not that important or not that significant. More or less, we always understand the ejection of blood from right ventricle and left ventricle are almost same. Ejection of blood or amount of blood ejected from right ventricle and amount of blood ejected from left ventricle is same. In a particular beat, it may be a bit different, but in the next beat, it is again corrected. So a time-bound average, a time-limited average of right ventricular cardiac output and left ventricular cardiac output are more or less same, or rather exactly same. So that is my answer. Next question. There are some of you put the question personally. Let me read those questions also. Some of you told afterload is pressure in the aorta which prevents the backflow of blood into the left ventricle by closing the semilunar valve. This is one comment, and he or she asked me whether it is correct or not. But it is not exactly correct. He again commented, grossly it is the total resistance offered by the vascular system against which the ventricle will have to contract to eject the blood. This resistance is afterload, sir. I can say it is more or less correct, but I will discuss in detail soon. Some other students asked, sir, pure isometric contraction differ from isometric contraction? So that is another question. Your friend Ritayan asked, good morning sir, if we say 5 liter is EDVV, then preload is 5 liter. But sir, all of it is pumped by heart, so afterload is 5 liter too. So sir, in all cases, afterload is equal to preload. Will you please tell if it is wrong? I answered that it is not exactly that. I will discuss in the next class, in the class. He also wrote, sir, for your last question, I think the walls of the heart are acting against the powerful contraction of the heart muscle, and thus the strength of the heart wall or blood vessel walls emerging from the heart is the afterload. So these are some of the questions, some of the comments made by you. Now I am here to describe everything and explain everything before you without any reasonable doubt. Now I told you that preload is the stretching force. Preload is the load which is applied on the muscle before contraction, and afterload is the load which the muscle has to overcome. And preload in intact heart is EDVV, and let us see what is afterload. Now if you try to imagine the intact heart is contracting. Intact heart is contracting, or ventricle is contracting, and as the ventricle is contracting, whether it is contracting isometrically or isotonically, ventricle can contract isometrically and ventricle can contract isotonically. How it is so, I will soon discuss. So whether it is contracting isometrically or isotonically, the intraventricular pressure is rising high. So whether a ventricle is contracting isometrically or isotonically, the intraventricular pressure of the ventricle or intraventricular cavitary pressure increases in the ventricle, and as the intraventricular pressure in the ventricular cavity increases, it will create a propulsion force or propulsion pressure for movement of the blood. Now whether blood will move out of the ventricle into the aorta or into the pulmonary trunk will depend upon one very important thing. Suppose this is the heart and this is the aorta and this is the pulmonary trunk. So aorta is emerging from the left ventricle and pulmonary trunk is emerging from the right ventricle, and there is generation of pressure. Here is the tricuspid valve, here is the bicuspid valve. So here is the tricuspid valve, here is the bicuspid valve. This is right atrium, this is right ventricle, this is left atrium, this is left ventricle, this is arch of aorta, and this is the pulmonary trunk. So if there is a contraction of heart, either left ventricle or right ventricle, if there is contraction of heart, either left ventricle or right ventricle, isometrically or isotonically, there will be development of intracavitary pressure. So cavitary pressure will rise, intracavitary ventricular pressure both in the right ventricle and left ventricle will rise, and that will create a pressure head which will try to propel the blood out of the ventricle. Say if we consider about the left ventricle only, the left ventricular contraction will tend to move the blood out of the left ventricle into the aorta. Now whether this blood will be displaced or not, will depend upon the development of pressure differential or pressure gradient along which the blood from the left ventricle will enter into the aorta. If the aortic pressure in the aorta is more than the left ventricular pressure, the blood will not enter. if the pressure in the aorta is lesser than the left ventricular pressure, then and then only this aortic valve present here, semilunar valve present here will open up and blood will propelled out of the left ventricle. Same thing happens in the right ventricle also. So, even with the development of mounting pressure in the left ventricle, whether it will be capable of displacing the blood out of the left ventricle into the aorta will entirely depend upon the pressure differential. If the pressure in the aorta is more than left ventricle, blood will not be displaced and this semilunar valve will not open up. And if the pressure in the aorta is less than, if the pressure in the aorta is less than the intraventricular pressure, then and then only this one-way semilunar valve will open up and intraventricular or left ventricular blood will be propelled out of the left ventricle and enter into the aorta, and that is known as ventricular ejection. So it is the aortic pressure or it is the pressure generated at the root of the aorta, the sum total of the pressure of the arterial system or our vascular system. So this arch of the aorta will then divide into large artery, medium sized artery, small artery, arteriole, and it will spread throughout our systemic circulation. It will be spreaded throughout our systemic circulation. It will be spreaded throughout our systemic circulation. And this pressure in the vascular system, overall systemic vascular system, the net resultant pressure which is reflected at the root of the aorta, that will determine, ultimately that will determine as an overall phenomena whether left ventricular ejection becomes possible or not. Or if it is possible, what is the amount of left ventricular ejection? If the pressure here is quite high, although it is lesser than left ventricle, but substantially high, then left ventricular ejection will be less because pressure differential will be less, pressure gradient will be less. So now it is very clear to you who is the afterload. Afterload in the intact heart is the overall arterial pressure. Overall arterial pressure, pressure of the systemic arterial tree, which is reflected at the overall effect, the resultant pressure of the whole of the vascular system as reflected in the root of the aorta or in the root of the pulmonary trunk present in the pulmonary system. Overall pressure in the pulmonary system as it is reflected in the root of the pulmonary trunk will constitute the afterload in case of intact heart, because it is that pressure which will determine the ventricular contraction or rate of contraction of ventricle, or in other words, the velocity of contraction. Greater the afterload, lesser will be the velocity of contraction. Lesser the afterload, greater will be the velocity of contraction. So what is afterload? Afterload, in case of systemic circulation, it is the overall systemic blood pressure or mean arterial blood pressure as it is ultimately reflected at the root of the aorta. And what is, in case of pulmonary circulation, it is the overall pulmonary blood pressure as it is reflected in the root of the pulmonary trunk, and that is constituting the afterload against which this powerful contraction of ventricular muscle has to overcome that afterload in order to propel or eject blood out of the ventricle. So this is about the afterload. I think probably you have understood it. Now with this backdrop, now let us discuss about a third factor which regulates these ventricular performance. Till now I have described two factors. To two loading factors. One is preload, another is afterload. So one is preload. So preload within physiological limit is helping ventricular performance, and afterload is antagonizing the ventricular performance based upon these two important curves. Now let us see the another third factor. Now another third factor, some of you mentioned also. Some of you mentioned, I could not find those questions. I would request you to place all the questions in the WhatsApp group, in the common WhatsApp group, so that all of your batchmates can see those questions. And don't directly send me, rather to post in the group, and it will be easier for me to find out the question. So, apart from preload and afterload, there is another very important factor, which largely influence the ventricular performance. What is that? That factor is known as inotropism. That factor is inotropism. What is inotropism? Now, inotropism is said to be a third factor which independently modify the loading parameters. So this inotropism is acting on the loading parameters. So inotropism is a third kind of factor which influence the loading characteristics. How? So inotropism, as per classically defined, is a third factor which independently modify the loading parameters, either preloading or afterloading. How it is so, and what it is exactly. Suppose this is the preload curve. Suppose this is somewhere Suppose in a particular preload, this is a stroke volume. Say, suppose for a particular preload, this is the stroke volume. Suppose the preload has increased to some extent. So if the preload is increased from here to here, stroke volume will increase from here to here. And that is simply the application of Stirling's law of heart. So as the preload is increasing, as the initial fiber length of the ventricular muscle fiber is increasing, it will lead to increased energy of contraction. And as there is increased energy of contraction, that will lead to increased ventricular ejection and increased stroke volume. Now suppose, if this curve is shifted downwards, or if this curve is shifted upwards and to the left. So this curve may be shifted downwards to the right or may be shifted upwards to the left. If it is shifted downwards to the right, then with the same preload, let me draw by hand, with the same preload, that will be the stroke volume. with that reduced preload, that will be the stroke volume. So with 2 preload, this was the initial stroke volume or change in stroke volume, but when the curve is shifted towards right and downwards, the overall ventricular performance is reduced. So this is the normal curve, and this is a negatively directed curve, and this is a positively directed curve. So in case of negatively directed curve, with the same set of preload, the ventricular performance will be reduced. And if it is increased like that, with the same set of preload, the ventricular performance will increase. So as the stiffness of the curve is increasing or the stiffness of the curve is decreasing, as the curve is shifted towards left or the curve is shifted towards right, with the same preload, the ventricular performance will be altered. So we say it is a factor which independently change the rate of operation of this preload, simply changing the sensitivity of the curve or bias of the curve. So this is the factor which is independently changing the bias of the curve without changing the preload. It is changing the outcome of ventricular performance by simply changing the relationship between preload and stroke volume, by simply changing the curve. And this feature, this factor is known as inotropism. So this is positive inotropism, this is negative inotropism, and this is in the normal regular state. So one is positive inotropism, one is negative inotropism, another is a normal regular state. So this is how inotropic factor is altering the ventricular performance in case of preload. Now let us see what is happening in case of afterload. See, for afterload, say if this is the afterload, that will be the velocity of contraction. If the afterload further decreases, that will lead to decreased velocity of contraction. So there are two sets of afterload. In this afterload, this is the velocity of shortening, and in this afterload, this is the velocity of shortening. Now suppose if the afterloaded curve is shifted here, or it is shifted here. If it is shifted above, what will happen? With the same afterload, the velocity of contraction will increase. With the same afterload, the velocity of contraction will increase. And in case the curve is shifted downwards and to the left, with the same afterload, velocity of contraction will decrease. With the same afterload, velocity of contraction will decrease. So this we can say is a positive ino, and this we can say as negative ino. And in between it is the normal. So what is the effect of inotropism? The inotropic effect will shift the preloaded curve or ventricular systolic function curve or ventricular performance curve to the left and upwards, and negative inotropism will shift the curve to the right and downwards. Whereas for afterloaded state, the positive inotropism is shifting the curve towards right and up, and negative inotropism is shifting the curve to downwards and left. And thereby, accordingly, it will change the sensitivity of the relationship or bias of the relationship. So it is a third factor which is acting independent, neither changing the afterload directly, nor changing the preload directly, neither changing the velocity directly, nor changing the stroke volume directly. It is only changing the location of the curve, position of the curve bias of the curve, stiffness of the curve, gradient of the curve, and thereby it is influencing the ventricular performance. So if we understand this much, we can summarize the whole issue like this. We can summarize the whole issue like this. So what are the factors which affect the ventricular performance? Which affect the ventricular performance, or which affect the amount of end systolic ventricular volume. What is end systolic ventricular volume? End systolic ventricular volume is EDVV, end diastolic ventricular volume, minus stroke volume is equal to end systolic ventricular volume. Normally, end diastolic ventricular volume is 130 ml, stroke volume is 70 ml, and end systolic ventricular volume is around 60 ml. Ventricle is never empty. Ventricle is always filled up of blood. Ventricle is always completely filled up with blood. So EDVV minus SB is ESVV. What is ESVV? So ESVV is indicating the ventricular performance. If the ventricular performance is more, ventricle is contracting more powerfully, then ESVV will be less. If the ventricle is not contracting very powerfully, then ESVV will be more. So what are the factors which determine ESVV? What are the factors? So ESVV stands for a parameter of ventricular performance. So what are the factors which determine ESVV? Number one, preload, which is EDVV. Number two, afterload, which is the overall pressure of the vascular system, either systemic vascular system or pulmonary vascular system, the resultant of which is reflected either at the root of the aorta or root of the pulmonary trunk. It is the load against which powerful ventricular contraction has to overcome in order to propel or eject blood into the either systemic circulation or in the pulmonary circulation. So that is afterload. And third point is known as inotropic state. It is also written as INO, inotropic state, and this inotropic state is nothing but the contractile ability of the ventricle or contractility. Inotropic state is nothing but the contractile ability of the ventricle or contractility. There is another fourth factor. Which I am intentionally and deliberately not mentioning because that is a bit complicated and that is usually the topic of postgraduate students. So for you, the determinant of ESVV, or in other words, the various determinants of ventricular performance are preload, afterload, and inotropic state. Now next, I have got several important things to discuss before you, but before that, I will mention something, or I will try to explain something. I don't have much time. It is already 10:30 in the night, so I have to discuss something about how some of your question, how ventricle sometimes contracts isometrically and how ventricle sometimes contract isotonically. So what is the example of isometric contraction and isotonic contraction? So what is isometric contraction and isotonic contraction in an isolated muscle strip in an experimental situation? That I have described adequately. Now how it is implied in the whole heart, that is the point which I shall explain now. Now all of you must have learned cardiac cycle in your school days. So what is cardiac cycle? Cardiac cycle is a series of various events which is happening in a repetitive fashion, in a cyclical fashion within the cardiovascular system. Although we say cardiac cycle, but it should be said as cardiovascular cycle. So it is a series of events, several such events, and there are several such parameters which are undergoing certain changes in a repetitive manner during a relatively fixed period of time, which is known as cycle time. So cardiac cycle has got a time, cardiac cycle time, during which there are several series of number of events. Now, if we for the time being, we try to understand the ventricular events, we shall discuss in detail about the cardiovascular system. For that purpose, I need to require a PowerPoint presentation. I will see how we can arrange that, not by simple board. Now, for the time being, if we consider the ventricular system, just try to imagine. So, ventricle and atria. So, this is atria, this is ventricle, this is septum, this is right ventricle, thin, this is thick right ventricle, this is tricuspid valve, and this is bicuspid valve, this is right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. So, what is happening? The blood is being filled from the atrium to the ventricle during ventricular diastole. So during ventricular diastole, blood is being filled from atrium to ventricle, and when the ventricular filling is completed, these tricuspid and bicuspid valve, they close. So when these valves are closed, this is aorta and this is pulmonary trunk. Aorta is originating from the left ventricle and pulmonary trunk is originating from the right ventricle. So when these cuspid valves, bicuspid and tricuspid, or in other words, atrioventricular valves, right and left atrioventricular valves or tricuspid and bicuspid valves are closed, the semilunar valves, that means the aortic valve and pulmonary valve, has not yet opened. So there is a small duration of time during which atrioventricular valves are closed, bicuspid and tricuspid valves are closed, but semilunar valves has not yet opened. Ventricle is filled up with blood, but it is closed from all sides. So ventricular filling has just completed, closure of the AV valve, but the semilunar valves present here, other aortic valve or pulmonary valves, they have not yet opened, so they also remain closed. So they are closed. So what happens? Ventricle is filled up with blood, it is closed from all sides. So it is acting as a closed cavity and completely filled up with blood, and blood is a non-compressible fluid or poorly compressible fluid. Just imagine a situation. So at the end of the diastole, after closure of the AV valve, ventricle is closed from all sides, completely filled up with blood, which is a non-compressible fluid. So in that situation, what happens? The impulse arises from SA node to AV node to bundle of His to right and left bundle, and through Purkinje fiber to the ventricle. So impulse arised, ventricle receives the electrical impulse and start contracting. Now when this ventricle is start contracting or actually contracting, the AV valves are closed and semilunar valves are not yet opened, and it is filled up with blood, which is non-compressible fluid, which even by the most powerful contraction of this ventricular muscle, they cannot compress. See, it is a kind of situation whereby most powerful contraction, the ventricular muscle fibers cannot shorten, cannot reduce its length, because here the load, this is an enormous load. This load is an enormous load, although it is a preload, but this preload is so high. This preload is so high because it is completely uncompressible fluid. Even the most powerful contraction of the ventricular muscle cannot shorten its length. Now, this kind of contraction during this small period of time, I repeat that when the AV valves are closed, but semilunar valves are not yet opened, ventricle is filled up with blood and it is contracting. This is the situation. This situation is known as isometric contraction phase of ventricle. This situation is known as isometric contraction phase of ventricle. During this, ventricle is contracting very powerfully, but failed to reduce its volume. Failed to reduce its volume in the three-dimensional orientation. It failed to reduce its volume. Volume remains same, but it is contracting, leading to enormous increase in the tissue tension. But the volume is not changing, so the intraventricular pressure is mounting high. Intraventricular pressure is mounting high as per Laplace law. P is equal to 2T by R. When R remains unchanged, the increase in tension will lead to increase in pressure, in double increase in pressure. So this is as per Laplace law. So as per Laplace law, what is happening? During this isometric contraction phase, or more correctly, isovolumetric contraction phase. During this isovolumetric contraction phase, the volume of the ventricle is not get reduced. All valves are closed. Ventricle remains in a closed cavity. It is contracting hard. The diameter or radius of the ventricle is not getting reduced. Right, so it is an isometric contraction. As it is an isometric contraction, there is enormous rise in tissue tension. Without change in radius, the overall intraventricular cavitary pressure is rising high. And as it is rising high and high and high and high, a point of time will come when it will overcome and it will pass beyond the aortic pressure. Beyond the aortic pressure or pulmonary artery pressure. When pressure in the ventricular cavity is more than the aortic pressure, what will happen? The semilunar valve will open, this pulmonary valve will open, and blood will gush out. Blood will gush out of it, and that is known as ventricular ejection. So how ventricular ejection becomes possible? Due to powerful isometric kind of contraction of the ventricle in a closed cavity filled up with blood. Blood is a poorly compressible fluid. Generation of enormous amount of intraventricular pressure, which will pass beyond the aortic pressure or pulmonary artery pressure. So the semilunar valve will open up and the blood will ejected out of the ventricular cavity through the aorta, and that is known as stroke volume or cardiac output. Now when this starts, when ejection of blood starts, then ventricular volume becomes shortened. It is no longer an isometric contraction, it becomes an isotonic contraction. As soon as the intraventricular pressure can overcome the aortic pressure, thereby flung open the semilunar valve and blood is coming out of it. then what is happening? There is isotonic contraction and net volume displacement and net work is being done. So can you understand that what is the implication and example of isometric contraction and isotonic contraction in case of an intact ventricle? So this is so in an intact ventricle or intact heart, isometric contraction leads to sharp rise of intraventricular pressure, so much so it can pass beyond the aortic pressure or pulmonary artery pressure, thereby creating a pressure gradient which will open up the cellular valve and leading to ventricular ejection. And blood is coming out at ventricular output or cardiac output or stroke volume. Stroke volume, as per definition, stroke volume is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle. It is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle per beat is known as stroke volume. And what is cardiac output? It is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle per minute is known as cardiac output. So this is the implication of isotonic contraction, isometric contraction and isotonic contraction in case of whole heart. So let us stop today. It is already 10 past 40. I have to close it down, although I have a lot of things to do. So in the next class, probably tomorrow, we shall have a summary of all the things which I have described till now. Summary of all of the things which I have described till now with the help of a diagram, with the help of a very important diagram, very important, crucially important diagram, which I am just giving you as a preparatory homework, that is known as pressure volume loop or PV loop of ventricle. Just go through it. That will be my next class. Pressure volume loop of the ventricle. That means relationship of volume changes and pressure changes within ventricle during a cardiac cycle. How volume change and pressure change, they are interrelated in a ventricle during an episode of cardiac cycle. That will be the next point of discussion, which is known as pressure volume loop or PV loop, and how this PV loop is looking like and how this PV loop is changing in different physiological variational state. That will be the next point of discussion. So in case of any question, please list those questions as you have did it today. Post in the common WhatsApp group so that everybody can see the question and we can have a nice discussion about those interactive questions before the initiation of the next class. Thank you.